Good evening or good afternoon, and a very, very warm welcome to this talk as part of London Art Week. My name's Clare Gough. I am director of Pitzhanger Manor, which is John Soane's country house in Ealing, West London. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Matthew Morgan, who is the director of Turner's House, Sandicombe
Absolutely.
Lodge in Twickenham. So we're tonight going to talk about the art of friendship. Sir John Soane and JMW Turner. They were two creative geniuses of their day, but they were also great, great friends. Despite the fact that Soane was 22 years Turner's senior, they formed a really strong bond that kept them close confidants and supportive friends right through from the 1790s through to Soane's death at the age of 83 in 1837. So that was a close friendship of over 40 years. So tonight we're going to take a bit of a look at a number of ways in which their lives intertwined, from how they first met at the Royal Academy, the crucial role that the Royal Academy played in each of their careers, and that other major influence on both of them, Rome and classical design. We're going to take a look at the two country houses that they built, Soane at Pitzhanger and Turner at Sandicombe Lodge, and the time they spent together in the country and the similarities between the two. But while we do this, we're going to try and draw out the ways in which each man had a really notable effect on the other one and helped to shape their respective lives. So perhaps let's start by introducing our two protagonists. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Well, here we have the two of them. Soane on the left, Turner in a self-portrait on the right. And Turner here as a young man, as a man full of confidence, a person who is at the beginning of his career, at the beginning of a career that would be incredibly successful and incredibly influential. He's not quite there yet, but I think there's something about the way that he's looking out at us that makes me think that he's a person with lots of confidence, which, of course, if you know anything about Turner, you'll know that he was. The son of a barber, wig maker from Covent Garden. If you go to Covent Garden today, there's a blue plaque. That's not the house itself. That house has been knocked down. But from humble, we might say, working class, we might now say in the 21st century, beginnings, prosperous, but nevertheless, certainly not middle class. And one of the things that I think is fantastic about Turner is that his father gave him the opportunity to become an artist instead of saying something along the lines of, well, why don't you become an architect? As perhaps Soane's parents said. Turner's father, old dad, as he called him, supported Turner. In fact, we know that he put up Turner's early drawings in the window of his barbershop. I live in hope that one day somebody's going to come up with one of these early drawings by Turner, which would be wildly exciting. Turner also loved the Thames. Although he was born and raised in Covent Garden, he spent lots of his youth along the Thames, particularly around Brentford. If anybody listening has been to Brentford today, it's almost impossible to imagine that once upon a time it was a quiet market town along the Thames, but it certainly was in Turner's day. And people talk about Constable and Constable country and Constable's love of Suffolk. And Turner, I think, is very much the same, but in love with the Thames. The Thames, to slightly labour the point, runs through his life until his death in Chelsea along the Thames. And there are so many elements of Turner's life that are reflected in Soane's life that although, as Claire said early on, there is such a age gap. I mean, they really are almost sort of father and son in terms of age. Actually, they were genuine friends. They shared not just interests, not just artistic interests, not just social interests, but came from a similar background. And I think that helped to shape their view of society, their view of Britain. Claire, tell us a little bit about
No,
Soane.
well, it's so interesting, and I think that's absolutely right. That huge age difference, but from very similar beginnings. So Soane born much earlier in 1753. Interestingly, also on the Thames at Goring on Thames, and we'll come back to that in a minute because that had less of an impact on Soane, but it is something he brings out certainly in his house at Pitzhanger, but son of a bricklayer, so from fairly humble stock. And delightfully, you see that in Soane's architecture later. He loves brickwork. So certainly at Pitzhanger, when other people might have been building in stone, you see beautiful, exquisite, neat brickwork. So no doubt that has an influence. But surely there must have been some element of the attraction, the friendship between these two, is because they have both bucked the system in a time when it wouldn't have been that easy to do it. They've both made it to that great institution, the newly created, the Royal Academy. And I suspect there was a huge amount of comparing of, how they approach things compared to some of their colleagues in the Royal Academy. I don't think the Thames, Pitzhanger is not on the Thames, but we'll see when we look at some pictures of Pitzhanger later how Soane does incorporate something that reminds him of his beginnings along the Thames. But Soane had a big breakthrough in his very early days. He was incredibly lucky and introduced to a rising star of the architect's profession, George Dance the Younger, to go and work for him. And actually, ironically, his very, very first job as a 15-year-old was working on an existing Georgian manor. And Dance had been commissioned to build an extension to this Georgian manor. And the reason why this is relevant is that Georgian manor was Pitzhanger Manor. It was an existing Georgian house. And we'll come back to later why Soane therefore comes back to buy the place, knocks down much of the existing Georgian manor to build what he later has as his country home there. But he was working for George Dance, and George Dance was one of the founder members of the Royal Academy and encourages Soane to go along. And Soane is, with amazing good fortune, wins a competition. And if Matthew can just show us the next slide.
Yeah, just before we go, because it's really just suddenly popped into my mind, just wanted to say a little bit about William Owen, who produced this portrait of Soane, which is at the Soane Museum. Claire and I were just saying he sort of manages to make Soane look a bit like a friendly uncle, which, if you know anything about Soane, you know he really wasn't. But William Owen himself was the son of a barber, very much like Turner, and they were both at the Royal Academy schools. Owen a little bit after Turner, about 2 years after. And it's interesting to sort of speculate what might have happened in Owen's career had he not died, sadly, very young. We don't really know why, but his funeral was attended by Thomas Lawrence, who was a friend of Turner's. So I think it's very likely that the two of them, Owen and Turner, knew each other, even if they weren't friends. Anyway, that's just an aside. I'm just going to.
And while I'm just on that portrait, just interesting to see there is Soane showing off, the inspirations to him there, pointing at the classical architecture that has inspired him, which we come on to in the next slide. So here in the next slide, Soane enters a competition, and this is on the right. You've got his design for a triumphal bridge, and rather delightfully, a few years later, he commissions Gandhi to draw up a picture of it. So that's a sort of a drawing of how it might have looked. And this is the amazing design that wins him the prize awarded by George III himself for Soane to be paid on a scholarship to go off on a grand tour. And of course, grand tour was what every rising architect wanted to do in those days. And it was transformational for Soane. What he saw along the way, he travels through France and arrives in Italy. In fact, spends most of his grand tour in Italy, never gets to Greece, but in Italy sees a whole range of classical architecture. And so I'm going to come on in a minute to talk about the huge influence of Rome on him. But this is the thing that got him there as a boy from a very humble beginnings. It got him to have that amazing influence both on his style, but also, terribly importantly, to meet the people who would in future become his clients, because otherwise he just wouldn't have had the chance to know them. So hugely influential on him. I don't know whether, Matthew, there are other sort of things it's interesting to talk about.
I just love this design, Claire. It sort of looks like it might be, in the 21st century, or in some sort of science fiction movie. Maybe it's in the new Dune movie, I don't know. But it's so imaginative, so incredible that it almost sort of defies imagination to think about what it might have been like if it had actually been built.
Well, maybe
And of
maybe we
course,
should have this instead of the garden bridge.
yes, maybe that's our next project.
Yeah, okay.
But I think your point about the Grand Tour is very important, which is that it was not just a way for somebody like Soane to get a first-hand knowledge, and here we'll come on to this in just a second, but a first-hand knowledge of classical art, architecture, sculpture, but also a way for aspiring artists and architects to make the connections that would be the foundations for their future careers. And somebody like Reynolds did exactly that yeah, in his Grand Tour. Met a number of important clients, who would then go on to have their portraits painted by him. And poor Turner misses out on this opportunity. Um, He's the youngest person ever to become a Royal Academician. Still can't say that word after all these years. At 24, he's still the youngest person. And I think partly because his background is not from money, he spends his immediate years after that building his career. And so when the French Revolution happens, he hasn't had a chance to go to the continent and misses out. So he and everybody else in Britain, more or less, except for soldiers, can't really go to Europe because of wars. But Turner then is in a spot where somebody like Soane has this wealth of knowledge that Turner can only imagine. And it isn't until 1819, after the final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, that Turner gets a chance to get to Waterloo. We'll probably Waterloo, Italy, indeed, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But I think this is certainly from the perspective of Soane, a very key image, which I think Claire's
Oh,
going to jump on
we
right
should,
now.
yeah. So Soane heads off on his grand tour in 1778. So as you say, fortunately before it was impossible to travel through France and get there. And with amazing timing, he turns up in Rome while they're in the middle of excavating this incredible Roman villa called the Villa Negroni, up near the baths of Diocletian. And as they uncover, they've started uncovering it just the year before Soane arrives, and they discover these incredible frescoes on the walls of the villa. And this literally caused a stir across Europe. People were astonished by seeing the frescoes, and this is one of 12 prints that were created contemporaneously, thank goodness, of the frescoes at the Villa Negroni. Thank goodness, because very, very sadly, shortly afterwards, the Bishop of Derry bought the frescoes, took them off the walls, carried them back, and then they got lost en route back. We think probably as part of the French, they got caught up in the French Revolution. So tragically, they were intended to come back to England or Ireland, one of his houses, and they were lost en route. But fortunately, we have these amazing prints of them. And Soane, in fact, many years later, buys a set for his home. He was so influenced by what he saw. So he was able to see the Villa Negroni with his own eyes when he arrived in Rome. And the influence of this and what else he saw in classical Rome was immense on him. And Pitzhanger, when we look in a minute at a few of the images of Pitzhanger, you'll see so many moments of similarity. The colours that are used here, the incredibly strong bright red is a colour that Soane uses in his drawing room to show off his paintings. But the painted marble that you see in the frescoes and the wonderful classical shapes. So we actually have a set of these beautiful prints hanging in Pitzhanger, and it's just really fun to draw the parallels between what he saw in Rome and what he's created subsequently. And I suppose that's just one tiny example of how much inspiration Soane took from what he saw. If we go to the next slide, I think we've got a Piranesi print, which Piranesi, it was somebody that Soane met and was hugely influenced by, but also it's just a sense of the ruins that he was seeing and was loving discovering. And Soane develops a fascination with ruins. And many of you may know that he was so fascinated by ruins that when he had designed the Bank of England, he then commissions Gandhi to draw his development of the Bank of England, the new enormous expansion that had been to the Bank of England under his time as architect and surveyor to it. He gets Gandhi to draw it as it would look many centuries hence as a ruin. He's fascinated by this idea of looking at how architecture will look in future years by other people when they come back to it as ruins. But the classical inspires everything that he does subsequently, but in a rather fun way in his architecture. He always takes the classical and then usually does a twist on it that makes it very much his own.
Just before we leave this slide, one of the things that I love about Piranesi generally is that he, in my mind, sort of stands almost at a crossroads between these ideas of classical architecture and what we now refer to as sort of neoclassical painting and architecture in 18th century Europe, but also romantic ideas, particularly the sublime, and this idea of some collapsing civilizations, gigantic buildings being taken back by nature, which we can see here, very much an idea of the sublime, very much an idea of the romantics, however one wants to define the romantics. Again, something that, as Claire was saying, very much an influence on Soane, also very much an influence on Turner. So, even without having seen these things himself, Turner is absorbing some of the main influences on aesthetic thought, I suppose, in the late 18th century.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about the two country houses that Turner and Soane built. So Pitzhanger Manor in Soane's case, and Sandicombe Lodge, as we mentioned before, for Turner. So Soane builds Pitzhanger between 1800 and 1804. So as I mentioned, he acquires the existing Georgian house called Pitzhanger Manor in 1800, and then completely remodels it to become his own dream country home. And he does very much set it up as a home that he hopes will be handed down through the generations and that will be lived in by a succession of Soane architects. He very much pictures that his sons will be architects after him and their sons will be architects after him. Now that's a dream that does not come to pass. But of course, the reason, as I mentioned before, the reason that he buys Pitzhanger Manor, the existing Georgian house, is because he was excited by the fact that he had worked on it as a young apprentice. So if you look at the plate on the left, which is a watercolor from 1832 by Richardson of Pitzhanger as created by Soane, the bit that he worked on is, if you look at the very, very left, you'll see a most sort of Georgian-looking wing beyond the rather flamboyant neoclassical bit that is in the main bit of the villa. But to the left of that, that's what's called the dance wing, and that's what Soane worked on. Soane was a little bit scathing about the house that was at Pitzhanger. He said it was very dull, very plain, but the interiors were rather lovely. So he basically, once he acquires it, knocks down the whole of the main bit of the building or remodels it so massively that you can't see it, while retaining the dance wing, which does have beautiful Georgian interiors and very elegant sculpted modelled ceilings. But then he rebuilds it in his own style, in that bit that you can see with the 4 classical columns on the front. And there's a picture of it as it is today. And then just a couple of fascinating things to see is that adjoining, if you come to the right of the villa, you could just depict, there's a bit of a colonnade that joins up his main bit of the villa to his kitchen block. And of course, the kitchen block in those days was separated from the house, so as not to run the risk of setting fire to the main house. But then he had this very strong view that no country house was really complete without a set of Roman ruins. Sadly, there were no Roman ruins in Ealing, and so he builds his own. So if you can see right to the right end of the picture, he has built a ruined temple. And he has it there for his visitors. He wants them to stumble across it and enjoy it. So that's very much sort of celebrating the ruins that he had seen on his travels. And the last thing I'm just going to say on this picture before we move on to Sandringham Lodge is you can see behind the house. So we're looking at it from Ealing Green because it was a house in the village of Ealing. And behind the house, you can see a rather elegant curving serpentine lake. That was effectively his ha-ha that would keep the cattle and the sheep from coming in and munching his roses in his garden. But way beyond that, in the further distance, there's a second lake, and that's where he would invite his mate, Turner, to come fishing with them. And they would spend a lot of time passing the time of day, sharing thoughts on light and how it falls on things. We don't quite know what the conversations were, but a lot of time fishing together at Pitzhanger. So tell us about Sandringham Lodge.
Yes, well, Claire, as you say, Turner came and visited Pitzhanger, a frequent visitor, and apparently one of the few people invited to spend the night.
The
Only
only
person.
friend who was
So,
not family. So one of the
so
fascinating
everybody
things
else got
about
to go back to
Pitzhanger,
London.
it was his dream country house, but it
Yeah,
only has enough bedrooms for the family. Huge house of entertainment, lots of big parties,
yeah,
big dinners, big garden parties out in the gardens outside. But it was come, party, and then please go home. Don't want
please
to
go
see you
on.
over breakfast, except for Turner. Turner, the only non-family member who was invited to stay. And he was there a lot. One summer he was there
He
practically
was,
the whole
yeah,
time.
yeah. And I like to imagine the two of them sort of, riding between the two houses, sort of coming to see each other. Sadly,
Yeah.
that's almost certainly not the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, I used to think about the route they would walk. Maybe they
Yeah,
planned it, but yeah, the dates
um,
don't match up.
the dates don't match up, sadly, because Turner buys the stretch of land that he uses onto which he builds his house, which we see here on the left in the only contemporaneous drawing of it. Turner never drew his house, either the exterior or the interior, and on the right, a photo from the street. And he buys the land in 1807, the year that he himself becomes Professor of Perspective at the Royal Academy. Soane has become Professor of Architecture the previous year, and their mutual friend John Flaxman is already Professor of Sculpture. Flaxman also a keen fisherman. So I like the idea of the three RA professors on a boat bobbing around fishing together, talking about, as you say, Claire, who knows what, over a glass of something, I hope.
Probably argue
Um,
about whose fish was bigger, but yeah.
Yes, or is it sublime or romantic? So they Turner, as I mentioned before, loves the Thames and had been renting various places along the Thames. And in the early 19th century, London must have been pretty horrible in the summer, hot, smelly, extremely smelly. And if you had any money, you left and you did what Soane did, and you moved to the west. Prevailing winds come from the west to the east. That's why the poorer parts of many places are in the east. And the river going down into London hadn't yet had a chance to be polluted. So the area itself was rather wonderful. But, and if we just go back a bit to Pitzhanger, we can see, imagine, you don't have to imagine, you can to this day go to Pitzhanger and be amazed, be bowled over perhaps by this incredible entrance. Compare this to Turner's house. Now, unlike Pitzhanger, where, as Claire was saying, Soane invited lots and lots of people. I pity poor Eliza Soane, Soane's wife, who had to arrange what seems to me to be a sort of non-stop number of parties again and again and
Social
again.
secretary, yes.
Turner,
And put up with his bad moods afterwards, I suspect.
Turner, as far as we know, didn't invite any clients to his house. One of the words that people often use when they visit is it's very domestic, it's very modest in size. It's not a big showy off place. It really is a very private place. And if you see just for a moment the view from the street, it's quite plain. The best view is the view in this picture here from the garden. only Turner's friends would have seen the view from the garden. Everybody else going up and down the street would have seen this view. So the best view is the view that we have from for his friends, that is reserved only for the inner circle. So now we ourselves can be the inner circle by going to visit Turner's house. So why did he build his own house is a question that other people ask. And I think it's that he had an idea of what the perfect domestic living would be. He wanted somewhere that was absolutely his vision. And if you know about Turner, you'll know that, particularly as he progressed in life, he was very determined that things should be the way that he wanted them to be. And I can just imagine that this is exactly the sort of thing that somebody would do with that vision, that this is the house that every bit of it screams out the vision that Turner has, even if it's quiet and restrained and modest. This is exactly how he wanted to live. I love
There we
this
go.
picture. This is
Who caught which one? That's the question.
I'm
Which is
afraid to
Soane's?
say I'm the director of Turner's House because of my art historical knowledge. I'm afraid not because of my fishing knowledge. No doubt somebody will come into the chat any moment now and tell
Yeah,
me
tell
which
me.
pertains to the trout and the perch.
Yeah.
Um, he loved to fish, Turner. And in fact, there's a fantastic letter from Sir John Lester, who lived in a place called Tabley Hall. He invited Turner up to paint the hall. And there's a fantastic letter in which he complains that Turner's spending more time fishing than he is drawing. He loved fishing everywhere he went. A lot of his great friends, as well as Soane, Sir Walter Fawkes, Lord Egremont, they fished with him or enabled him to fish as well. And this is something that I think the two men had in common. And gosh, isn't that the sort of the basis for most friendships in life, is to actually have
Yeah, makes
something that you
and this
that you like to do.
yes. And interestingly, I mean, Soane worked incredibly hard. He was an
Mm,
incredibly prolific producer of plans and designs, constantly changing, constantly evolving. And I think really that fishing was the only sort of hobby that he allowed himself. He did stuff in the gardens, but really it was fishing was his escape. And I suspect loved that opportunity to chew the cud,
mm,
talk a bit about politics in the RA, exchange ideas, but possibly the one moment he got for relaxation. I wanted to share a few pictures of inside Pitzhanger because we'll see also sort of the influence that they have on Turner and what his designs were for
mm,
Sandiacre. But here you've got on the left a photo today of the breakfast room at Pitzhanger Manor, and on the right, a drawing that Joseph Gandy did of it that was actually displayed at the Royal Academy's summer exhibition and showing off the designs for Pitzhanger. But going back to those differences between the use of Pitzhanger and Sandiacre Lodge, Soane used Pitzhanger as a place to entertain clients in the hope, to entertain friends in the hope that he would turn them into clients and that he would get that commission. And I sort of rather picture the idea of, after a glass or two of claret, well, indeed it wouldn't have been claret because of the French War. So after a glass or two of Portuguese wine, he would rather sort of nudge them over the edge and get them to commission something from him. And so he very much sees the main rooms, the main entertaining spaces of Pitzhanger as a sort of walk-in portfolio. And here in the breakfast room, you're seeing one of those most classic of Soanian designs, the canopy dome ceiling. Here, the beautiful oculus that gives a hint of the Italian sky above, inspired, of course, by the Pantheon that he had seen in Rome. But you'll see that design in a whole number of permutations appear in everything that Soane designed subsequently. And those of you who are familiar with the John Soane Museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields will see a later version of this, which is much, much more ornate. But what's rather fun at Pitzhanger is you see Soane's style almost frozen as it was in that short period that he was there between 1800 and 1810. So you see it in sort of almost like its simpler form. And there in the drawing that you've got by Gandy, you've got Eliza beyond in the library, and I'll show you in a second a picture of the library. But what I also wanted to draw your attention to is that Soane also used Pitzhanger to show off his growing collection of art and artifacts. And these ranged from contemporary art, so we'll come on to that in a second, to wonderful historic artifacts. So in 1800, Soane bought at auction an amazing Greek vase called the Cawdor vase because it came from the collection of Baron Cawdor. Absolutely astonishing. And you can see it drawn here in this picture by Gandhi. Can you see on the left, on a side, if you go on the left, in the picture on the right, but on the left, that's where the cursor is. And it's a huge, big and beautiful vase, black with terracotta coloured figures dancing across it. And so he designs this room to show off this vase. And so he paints a sort of a marble effect wall behind it to show it off to great effect. And you can see a few more of his classical vases and other classical artifacts that he's acquired since his grand tour. And one of the things that's really lovely about this is it's not just showing off his collection to show what an amazing collection I've got. He's also taking very seriously this idea that today, just like Turner couldn't, young men could not go on that grand tour in the way that he had done. They couldn't have that amazing opportunity to learn from seeing the classical remains himself. And so he sees having his collection as a really wonderful opportunity to help train his apprentices, his own sons, he hopes. Sadly, that doesn't work out, but his apprentices, the people who work with him, young architects, in sketching the pieces that he has so that they can get as close to the experience that Soane had from his grand tour. So effectively, this is the beginning of the whole idea of a school of architecture. And it's something that we've taken real inspiration from in Pitzhanger in terms of trying to think about the learning and education work that we do with students today, but picking up from where Soane left off, of inspiring young architects with the collection that he has around him.
And I think it's fair to say that Turner was also inspired by Soane. When Turner was elected to be professor of perspective, the only other applicant was Joseph Gandhi, who produced this fantastic picture, watercolor on the right. And Gandhi and Soane worked together in various ways for about 30 years. And I always think of Gandhi as a bit like a sort of an alternative Turner, both roughly the same age. Gandhi does go away and train as an architect, which Turner doesn't really. Gandhi does just about get to go on a grand tour, which Turner doesn't. And Gandhi is also interested in the effects of the sublime. Clare was talking about his depiction of the Bank of England in the future, sort of slightly collapsed. And one of the many ways in which people think about Soane, and particularly the buildings that he either designed and weren't built, or designed and were built, is through some of these watercolors that Gandhi produced. And I'm just going to draw your attention to this rather wonderful curtain around this picture. Don't just keep it sticking in your mind for a little bit, because we'll see something similar a little bit later, produced by Turner. Claire, you were talking about this a bit earlier on.
Yeah, this is just the entranceway, and I just wanted to flash this up for a second. This is the entrance arch that leads you to Pitzhanger. You can see the villa. Hidden behind the tree are those four columns with the caryatids on top. But I just wanted to mention this because this has got a really unusual material in it, flint. And it's otherwise brick and stone, which is what the rest of Pitzhanger is built out of. But why flint? And it's really interesting. Flint is not local to Ealing. Where you get flint is down in Sussex, Bart, the other place, Goring-on-Thames, or Henley, that area around. And there are different theories about this, but Soane sees Pitzhanger as an opportunity to sort of create effectively a self-portrait. And some argue that it was done because it was, it's being rustic, so the split flints makes it look quite rustic. The other argument is maybe he's saying that's where I came from, that's where I started, and then you come up to me as what I am, as the great architect. But I just wanted to show that. The other thing is quite fun is just the classical symbol of the winged eagle, the eagle within the wreath. That is a theme that Soane repeats throughout, almost becomes a leitmotif at Pitzhanger, and you see it throughout things. So it's quite fun to see that on the entrance as you come in. And of course, very importantly, that is the same canopy dome ceiling that we've just been looking at in the breakfast room. If you look at those two pillars, we're now looking on the outside of the canopy dome ceiling. And of course, it was that design, whether from this or from Eliza's tomb, but that design by Soane that inspired so many years later Gilbert Scott when he won the competition to design the telephone box. It was from Soane's designs of the canopy dome ceiling. And of course, that is the shape of that most iconic piece of design on the corner of every high street across the UK. So it's lovely to see Soane's designs having such influence. And then here, I just wanted to quickly show you the library at Pitzhanger, because this demonstrates the other ceiling for which, the other trademark ceiling for which Soane is so famous, the starfish dome ceiling, another canopy dome, but the starfish dome in this case. And again, you can see this design in so many other places, most particularly, very specifically, this design is the same design as Soane does 23 years later when he's commissioned to design the dining room at 10 Downing Street. And of course, by then he's doing a much more flamboyant design, but this is one that he repeats in different permutations many times. But as I said earlier, Soane uses Pitzhanger as an opportunity to display his collection, and it ranges from the antique, as we saw with the Court vase, to what was for him contemporary art. So he had pictures by Gough, but of course he needed to have some pictures and wanted to have some pictures by his great mate Turner. So this, the refectory at Kirkstall Abbey, is one of the paintings that Eliza actually purchased and would hang in the small drawing room at Pitzhanger. And when the Soanes later left Pitzhanger, very sadly, when relations with their sons broke down so appallingly, it was one that Eliza really brought closely to her and kept in the sitting room around her in their house in Lincoln's Inn Fields. So it was obviously a painting that she was very fond of and suggests, I think, more also of friendship. It reminded her of their friendship with Turner.
I think that Eliza and Turner were friends, as well as Turner and Soane himself. We know that Eliza bought the paintings herself without Soane's a presence, really. She visited Turner's gallery in central London, Marylebone, in 1804, and she bought two paintings. She records them in her diary, and she spent what actually is quite a lot of money, sort of £36 and 15 shillings on this particular picture, which Turner had in his studio, in his gallery, since 1798. And Turner produced this after his first major tour of the North in 1797, which really is one of the most important early influences on Turner's painting. It's really, in some ways, where he starts to discover the sublime, which in turn sort of leads him to start thinking about the sort of the emotive content of painting, away from trying to capture what you can see, and more towards trying to capture what you can feel. But he's not quite there yet, I don't think, in this Kirkstall Abbey image. This, I think, is sort of something that's really trying to tap into what was then very fashionable, which is the ideas of the Gothic. Here we have the collapsed, really, interior of a medieval abbey, Gothic abbey, which is now being used for cattle. The Roman Catholic monks long since chased away in the Reformation. But there, I think, is something charming, so calming in this scene. Maybe it's the cows, perhaps it's just me, I don't know. But I think there's sort of something rather unlike most Gothic things, where there's often something sort of rather kind of unsettling and terrifying. It doesn't here, and I can see why this might fit into your drawing room, into your sort of study, rather, into a sort of private space.
Yeah.
that's not too challenging.
Perhaps
In
interesting
the
to look
same
at the other one that
yeah, sorry,
he. So
Claire, yeah,
yeah, so here in the next
yes,
slide is the other painting
exactly,
that
exactly.
Eliza
So at
buys
the same
for
time,
Pitzhanger.
Eliza buys this, which really is all about the Gothic. In 1802, there's a brief pause in the hostilities between the French and the English. The revolutionary government sort of collapses in France, and the British think this is a great time to have a peace. Perhaps it is, but what happens next is Napoleon comes along and war resumes. But in this sort of brief period, really just months, there's a huge influx of Brits onto the continent. Many of them rush to Paris, which is what Turner does. He then goes to the Alps. And while he's there, he is producing works with an eye to selling them. He produces a rather wonderful catalogue of scenes which he brings back to show to various people in order to find out which ones they want him to work up into finished watercolors. Now, this isn't one of those. The subject of this is it's not clear. It's always been called St. Hugh denouncing vengeance on the shepherd of Courmayeur, which it may well be. There is, however, like lots of Turner things, it's not always terribly clear what's going on. And there's some suggestion that actually this is even more obscure than St. Hugh's. It might be somebody called the Curé of Morgeau, who converted the people of Courmayeur by walking into their village and turning the water in the fountain which we can see here, into wine. In a way, it doesn't really matter, because what really matters, I think, are these wonderful, wonderful clouds looming over, coming down from the valley, coming down the mountain at us, over us, about to take over everything. A very inherently sublime effect. And this is a sort of continues, I think, to be a rather wonderful, wonderful watercolor. And I think it reflects very well on Eliza that she picked out both of these
And
and the
amazingly
things.
contemporary taste, which is one of the
Yes,
things I love about Soane, is the way he mixed up in his collection, or Soane and Mrs.
yes,
Soane, um, the contemporary with the historic and the classical, and it's a wonderful thing to have done, and something we try to carry on doing by putting completely contemporary art into Pitzhanger. And oh my goodness, what an amazing
yep,
architecture that it enables you to hang contemporary art so beautifully there. But I think the other thing it's fun to talk about a bit is light, and light in that amazing
yeah.
watercolor. And here, of course, how Soane and then Turner replicating it plays with light. And of course, Soane was often known as the master of light, the way he used light as an architectural tool within his buildings. And one of the things for which he is so famous is the use of roof lights in all sorts of ways. But here you are looking up two different staircases. One on the left is Pitzhanger, and one on the right is Sandercombe Lodge. And in the middle, you're looking down from the roof light down into the center of the staircase. But this is just one of many examples, and we'll see a couple of other pictures in a minute of Soane's manipulation of light to such fantastic effect to create moody shadows and wonderful highlighting of features.
Well, the two of them were, in their own ways, fascinated by the effects of light. And I mentioned earlier on that Turner was a professor of perspective. It took him nearly 4 years to write his first lecture. I often say if it took me 4 years to write a lecture, I'd probably be destitute by now. But in that period, Turner and Soane clearly spent a lot of time talking to each other. And Soane was really influenced by the fifth lecture that Turner gave, which was about light, particularly about refraction of light and reflections of light. And Turner produced, and I'm going to jump forward just a little bit, these wonderful, wonderful sketches, drawings, which he used to demonstrate his lectures. He was a notoriously bad lecturer. People couldn't understand what he was saying. He mumbled a lot. I think that he was better at conveying his ideas visually than verbally. But you can see here, I hope, that we have these sort of wonderful metal globes, and Turner is showing the reflection of the room. I've spent a long time sort of trying to work out which room it is. I think it's probably a room in Marylebone rather than the room at Sandicombe Lodge at Turner's house. But when Turner is thinking about these effects, if you go into some of the rooms at Pitzhanger or at the Soane Museum and you think about the effects of light, Turner is influencing Soane to think about how light bounces around a room, bounces off mirrors, for instance, or comes through coloured glass, such as here. So on the right, we've got the ley light in Turner's house. Above the staircase, you can see it just here. I'm pointing with my finger. You can't see that. Up here, on a sunny day, and I hope you will all come and visit on a sunny day. The light is coming through, reflected on the wall of the staircase, and it moves up the
So
staircase
pretty.
in a
So
rather
pretty.
wonderful way. And
So
so
lovely.
yes, Soane has this effect at Pitzhanger, which you can see on the right,
Absolutely.
but also in Soane's house in central London as
Yeah.
well. So
And
this is not obviously not something that is just by accident. I think this comes from the two of them
yeah,
having sort of
talking
discussed
about
it
it.
at
Yeah.
great length, no doubt while fishing, hopefully while fishing.
Yes.
Claire, I'm just looking at the time. Should we
Yeah.
just sort of run ahead? Here's Turner's studio gallery in central London. It's almost certain that Turner and Soane worked together on this. There was a very ingenious central heating system. You don't want your clients to be cold. And we know that Soane worked and was fascinated by all sorts of what was then very kind of modern
Absolutely. And
inventions
and and,
like
and
central heating.
And perhaps just most importantly to see, and we can see it here in Turner's gallery, but also in the next picture of Dulwich Picture Gallery. Remember that Soane was the person who designed the first ever purpose-built gallery here at Dulwich Picture Gallery, and very famous for these roof lights that light it so elegantly. And here's a painting by Gandhi of it, but a plan cooked up with his great friend, whose collection established, Francis Bourgeois, whose collection established Dulwich Picture Gallery. And we kind of imagine a lot of these conversations may have happened over dinner at Pitzhanger, but using those roof lights, at which he was so brilliant at to light the gallery so well. But yes,
It is amazing.
let's canter on so we can leave time for people to share some questions.
Yes.
This is sadly a bit of a moment where they might have had a falling out. They didn't, which is great. But Soane asked Turner to do a picture for his house, the former Romanum, but never quite made the grade. Matthew.
No, it didn't. I asked you to sort of think a little bit about, or keep in your minds the picture by Gandhi. Can you see here we have this arch, perhaps very much like the sort of the Gandhi. It isn't a curtain, but it is something through which we're looking
Framing
at
it.
this scene, completely made up by Turner. It doesn't exist in real life. We know Turner spent a lot of time communicating with Soane, trying to get the detail right. By this time, 1826, Turner had been to Italy, but he was very keen to get the details as correct as possible, which is not usual for Turner. Turner's not a details person, at least not in his paintings. Turner also painted it to be a specific size, so it would fit into Soane's house. When it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1826, it came in for a lot of criticism because of the yellow colour that is used almost entirely for not just the buildings. It appears in the sky. It appears again in some of the people. It's everywhere. And Turner loved yellow. It appears increasingly in his paintings after his first trip to Italy in 1819. Soane also loves yellow. Yellow
Does
appears
indeed.
in many of Soane's buildings,
It does.
particularly
Strong
in
colours,
light.
as he goes.
Sorry?
Strong colours. Now I'm just going to
Yes.
intersperse for a second because we've had an interesting question here, which I thought it was
Ah,
good to pick
fantastic.
up on while we just been talking about the houses. So the question is, if Soane had an influence on Turner's illuminated staircase,
Yes.
did Soane also influence any other aspects of the design of Turner's house? So definitely the answer is yes.
Yes.
So come and visit both and you'll see them.
Absolutely.
But Matthew, do you want to particularly
Yeah. I mean, it's in some ways hard to know where to start because there's so many influences. Soane did not design Turner's house, otherwise we would have the plans.
although I
But
somehow suspect he might have done it on the back of a, whatever the equivalent in those days was, on the back of a napkin. I think there might have been a
yes,
few little scribbles
it's
for him.
it's impossible that Soane didn't have an enormous influence. So we've looked at the staircase. Um, Claire mentioned the Villa Negroni next to the bars of Diocletian. There's an architectural feature called a Diocletian window, which is sort of a curved window, which appears either in a basement or high up to bring in the light. There's a fantastic Diocletian window in the basement of Turner's house. The entrance hall of Turner's house, if you go to the Sir John Soane Museum and you go to Turner's house, you'll see they are almost exactly the same. There are all these sort of elements to it, the curved edges of the house. If I can just go back a little bit in these slides, oops, curved edges, which you can't very well see here, but are easier to see here. They appear in cottage ornate, which is a sort of a or basically a little cottage in a garden that's a sort of design feature, ornate cottage that Soane designed. And these features along the top, they're called triglyphs. They're completely decorative. They also appear in some of Soane's architecture, and they're supposed to hark back to ideas of some of the earliest pieces of architecture, or the ideas of the earliest pieces of architecture, which were thought to be sort of pre-Grecian. So if you have a building with the struts on the corner, these are the struts of wood that are holding up the roof. So there's all these different ideas together.
Yeah,
If
and
you come
lots
to
that they
Turner's
would
house,
have
when you come to
influenced.
Turner's house and when you come to Pitzhanger, you'll be able to kind of experience these two architects working surprisingly closely together.
Yeah, which is lovely. And one last question that I'm going to very quickly answer, just by, if we can go back to that picture of the library, Matthew. The question was, tell us a bit more about that curtain in the library. So I'm just going to say one thing on that, which was, I think, quite fun. So this is of the breakfast room looking through to the library. I said that this was a picture that had been submitted by Soane to the Royal Academy because for the summer exhibition, because of course in the summer exhibition it was not only of new paintings but also of architecture. So this was submitted as, here is the architecture that I am designing at Pitzhanger. And I think that rather lovely curtain, mirrored, as Matthew said, in that Turner picture with a frame, is done by saying, we are presenting to you this room. And so it's done as if you're at the theatre and yes, you are looking into the breakfast room. In fact, you're standing in the window at Pitzhanger looking at the breakfast room through to the library, but it's presented as, let me reveal to you as a theatrical thing, Soane's designs for Pitzhanger. And there's no doubt that how Soane designed you as the visitor to come to Pitzhanger was as a theatrical reveal, and he would place these artifacts to have an impact on his visitor. And I'm very conscious we got only not very much time left. So I wondered if we could skip on to the last slide, because I'd just like to share a rather moving
Indeed.
tribute. If you could go one further on, which is this one here. So after some turmoil in his relationship, there's so many other stories we could share with you about both Soane and Turner and the support that they gave him. But Soane had a very, very sad falling out with his family, and Turner was immensely supportive in that. Basically, Turner Soane and his sons completely fell out, and his son published a very insulting letter anonymously about Soane's work, and Turner accompanied Soane when he went to find out that it really was by his son, and Soane, Turner supported Soane when he lost his wife, and in all sorts of ways. So the friendship was really, really strong, despite the fact that I think Soane was a pretty blooming difficult person to be with. The relationship remained really strong till the end. So what I wanted to share with you is this rather beautiful painting by Turner of ancient Rome. But I want you to look at it quite carefully. And if you look carefully, you see that that bridge is Turner's interpretation of the triumphal bridge that was so influential to Soane and his life. It was that bridge that got him his scholarship to go on the Grand Tour. And this painting, painted in 1839, it's 2 years after the death of Soane. And we take this as a tribute by Turner to his old friend by painting this as a sort of recognition of all that Soane really had achieved. And I think it's rather an amazing tribute by a friend after such a long friendship, as we said, of over 40 years, and rather special.
It is, and I like to think that these people here in the foreground are representing the two friends on a boat on the river, enjoying the experience of being together and the experience of being on the river. Very quickly, we just got a few more minutes. There are a couple of questions. As I knew somebody in the audience was going to put me right about the fish, if you bear with me, I'm just going to get back to the fish because some very knowledgeable person has told me that the orange-coloured fish are the perch and the brown fish are the trout, which I know is something that people wanted to know. Also, somebody said, did John Ruskin visit these houses? The friendship, if you can call it a friendship between between Turner and Ruskin, really happened after Turner sold his house. He, in 1826, sold his house, his country house, Turner's house, and he really wasn't using it. He'd been going onto the continent more and more frequently. So by the time Turner and Ruskin became friendly, Turner no longer had the house, sadly. So we don't really know if Ruskin visited him in his house in London. I suspect almost certainly he did, but not in Richmond or in Twickenham. Another quick question, just very, very, very quickly. Are there any letters between the two of them? Sadly, no. We know that Turner was a reasonably wrote a lot of letters. We don't have any to Soane. Most of the letters that he wrote to friends were destroyed by the relatives of the friends after they died. There is a long out of print book of Turner's letters, which is rather sadly very slim. It
What
would
we
be
do
wonderful
have is we do have diary notes of Turner's visits, sometimes by Soane and sometimes
to.
by Eliza, recording that Turner had been, and sometimes some of the conversations that have been going on between them. So they're not letters, but some diary notes. And then one very quick other question is, where is that picture with Soane's bridge? Well, there were two pictures we looked at. The one by Gandhi that we showed you at the very beginning, that is in the Sir John Soane Museum. And then that gorgeous painting that Turner does as a tribute to his friend is part of the Turner bequest that is at Tate. And perhaps just a very last word maybe on that is that Soane left his house and collection to the nation by Act of Parliament, sadly, because he'd fallen out with his family. But it feels like there might have been an influence again, one man on the other, that Turner then leaves his collection of paintings to the nation with the Turner bequest. So both of them leave something
Yes.
very, very substantial.
Yes, which we're lucky enough to have today. So very quickly, do please come and visit Turner's house. Obviously, also visit Pitzhanger as well. Turner's house is in St Margaret's, which is just near Twickenham. You can get there on a train from Waterloo. It takes about half an hour. We are open Wednesday through Sunday from 12 until 4. On the 6th of July, our next exhibition opens. which is going to be about Turner and the environment, a world of care, which is looking at the things that Turner saw in his own lifetime and recorded how the world around him was changing and how many of these things continue to this day. So do please come and visit. It'd be lovely, lovely to see you all. There's my pitch for coming to Turner's house, and
Quite
I know
right too.
Claire
And
is
I
going to
can
say the
tell you
same
it's
thing about Pitzhanger.
well worth it. Well worth the visit. And then do come and visit Pitzhanger. And it's absolutely fascinating to make that comparison between Pitzhanger and Turner's house, and where those influences, you will see those influences from Soane
Indeed,
in Turner's work,
indeed.
but also look at the difference between Soane's work at Pitzhanger and some of his so many other very beautiful places, including Dulwich Picture Gallery. And we have a rotating programme of exhibitions on at Pitzhanger, both in the gallery there and then contemporary art shown across the house. So we'd be delighted to welcome you there. Just also to say that tomorrow is the last in the series this week of London Art Week. So don't forget, same time tomorrow at 5 o'clock, there will be another talk on. But just wanted to thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and we very much look forward to welcoming you at both Turner's House and at Pitzhanger. Thank you, and a very
Fantastic.
good evening.
Thank you so much, everybody. Keep well.